All right, so in this video, I'm going to talk about the article Why We Trust the Police by Stan Gilmour, who is a police officer in the UK. And so he's really coming from his experiences within police departments and also some empirical research he's been doing. So this essay is more about how can we reform the police and build public trust and confidence with the police force. And the general kind of contradiction here is that we have this relationship between like the civilians and the citizens of a country, the people who live there, the police officers or the institution of the police, and then the state or the government. And so it's seen as the police working for the state or the government rather than working for the people. So how can the police kind of be in control of the people that they're also trying to empower? At least that's not necessarily how people see it, but in terms of a goal of the police department, right? They're also trying to work with the public, but then how do they work with the public if the public doesn't trust them, right? If they're viewed as agents of the government and they're trying to exercise authority, well, how can they exercise authority if people don't trust them? And so that's why it's about building trust and kind of going beyond this idea of an us versus them mentality and performance metrics and quantitative information. And so the author's main point is that the police has to exist in a way where they're building solidarity and trust and justice with the public. And he says this is much more effective than kind of this coercive authoritarian policing that we're seeing. So what is trust? He says trust is a difficult term. It can mean a lot of different things when we're thinking about it, but it has to do with, building faith in something and assuming that something will happen by taking a risk. So you have to be willing to take a risk based off of perhaps prior experiences, right? It takes time. And so trust, it's contextual, but when we're thinking about justice, right, it takes time to build, and it has to do with legitimacy. And also trust has to do with building confidence, right? Building confidence in the police force, viewing them as valid, viewing them as having authority, but at the same time, in order to get to that point of legitimacy and confidence, you have to have prior good experiences with them as individuals and also as an institution. So their authority has to be viewed as legitimate rather than just as this governmental entity. So building that solidarity, building relationships with people is essential to building trust, legitimacy, and confidence. And also police have to be accountable for their actions. So there has to be, a fair court process as well. And this accountability is based off of the confidence that needs to be built when it comes to thinking that the police can be moral beings and make ethical decisions to not mislead you, and also a procedural kind of justice or procedural base where they're following rules that are viewed as fair and equal rather than unequally implementing them when they are in contact with civilians. So justice then is kind of this overarching goal when it comes to building trust with the police. But justice it's not just isolated in a vacuum. It doesn't just have to do with crime. It has to do with building social relationships and social systems. And so, how can that be gradually built in a way that requires, community solidarity and democracy and those kind of pillars that we hold highly in Western society. So in order for this justice to exist, there has to be greater trust between individuals and the police, and then that will lead to a greater trust within the police system in general, right? If more people have better experiences with them, then less people will be so distrustful of the police as an institution. So how can we trust the police, right? It has to do with building this confidence, this legitimacy, this accountability. And also, the author says we have to change the framework of how police departments measure performance and success. And so oftentimes police encounters with people are viewed as a means to an end to these performance metrics, which have to do with quantitatively the ways in which, police departments have reduced crime. But the author says that crime reduction doesn't necessarily lead to less of a fear of crime, and it also doesn't lead to people trusting the police more. So those are not necessarily correlated with one another. And in order to go beyond the performance metrics way of existing for police departments, right, it needs to be more about quantitative information, it needs to be more about qualitative, right? It needs to transcend the quantitative and say, hey, qualitative relationships need to be built between police and civilians or police and individuals. And so that is something that police departments should also be measuring. It should go beyond these limited performance matrix and really focus on how people how police departments or police officers individually can build trust in their communities in order to do what they need to do in terms of reducing crime. So reduction in crime then is not something that should only be measured, right? This trust and these relationships should be measured. And it has to do with this habitual kind of working together with the community. But of course, the police, their power also needs to be checked, right? So making sure there's not corruption happening, going beyond the us versus them mentality, giving people of color who are oftentimes obviously the most marginalized when it comes to police encounters, giving them more of a voice so society at large can trust the police. So police reform then, from the author's perspective, basically starts with trust and building relationships with the public rather than just policing.